Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Hemfar, and today I'll be doing another essay video for you guys. This is another sci-fi essay video. I've done 17 fantasy essay videos. I've done one sci-fi essay video. Um, these are just kind of things that I enjoy. They're normally things written by authors about stuff they're writing. This one is not actually about something this author has written, as far as I'm aware. Um, but it is by an author though. And that is actually the Neuromantic Cyberpunks by Norman Spinrad. Spinrad is a new wave author. I haven't actually read anything by him. I would like to read The Iron Dream, which was mentioned actually in Michael Moorcock's Starship Stormtroopers, which I haven't done a video on. I'm not sure if I will, but it would make a good sci-fi essay video, I think. But anyways, it's a 1986 essay, as actually originally titled The Neuromantics. Okay, you can find it now in Science Fiction in the Real World, which is a collection of essays by Spinrad, and he has retitled it because Cyberpunk has obviously the name that everyone knows for the genre. But he had originally proposed pretty much calling it, these people, the Neuromantics, right? I guess the Neuromantic genre or something like that, which of course comes from Neuromancer, the book by William Gibson. So this actually, he tells us he prefers the term Neuromantics, obviously from that book that began this movement of cyberpunk, but also maybe because it sort of kind of sounds like New Romantics, which is kind of related to the music movements that were going on kind of in tandem that Spinrad kind of talks about later. So he mentions cyberpunks, and particularly he starts with a panel from the 1985 North American Science Fiction Convention in Austin, Texas. On this panel were Bruce Sterling, John Shirley, Louis Shiner, Rudy Rucker, or something like that, who are obvious cyberpunks. There's also Greg Bear, who is definitely denies being a cyberpunk. Kind of questioning why he's on this panel. But then he dives into Neuromancer a little bit. He goes in as telling us Case is a punk. He doesn't really talk about Case working for the man really at all in this, because Cyberpunk in Neuromancer, he starts off as a punk, but he very quickly works for the man for most of the novel. So but we don't really get into that. But he describes him as a punk with influence from like Harlan Ellison's like punk figures in his similar protagonists from his works. Spinrad also mentions William Burroughs likely being a big influence on Gibson as well. Then he gets into a bunch of like cultural context and background. So here's a quote. It says, by the end of the 1970s, punk had taken on new meanings, though curiously enough, black leather jackets and defiantly artificial hairdos had once more became the trappings of a kind of rebellion. So similar to the 1950s punks in that sense, but not like the 1960s punks. The black leather and DA punks of the 1950s were rebelling against mom, apple pie, sexual repression, intellectuality in the America of Dwight Eisenhower and Norman Rockwell. And their libidinal marching music was, interestingly enough, already primitively electronic, to wit, early primary stage rock and roll. These punks disappeared into history in the 1960s, their fate being sealed when Bob Dylan and the Beatles began the transformation of rock and roll from the ass-kicking music of Elvis and street gangs and the music of the politically conscious transcendental revolutionary utopianism that spawned the counterculture. I would say you probably still get both types of rock these days, but still, I guess it's fair. And then also, here's another quote. It says, so the punks, or new wavers, who emerged towards the middle of the 1970s were not at all the same as the punks in the 1950s, despite the superficial trappings. For those nouvelle punks, anyways, these new punks, pretty much, right, were in rebellion against the counterculture sensibilities of the 1960s, not the long gone innocent ennui of the 1950s. What they were in rebellion against was the self-conscious artistness of the early 1970s rock and failed laid-back utopianism of the countercultural mysticalism and the naive supposition that the future would be better if youthful idealism kept the faith. If the punks of the 1950s really were anti-intellectual hoods, the new punks of the 1970s were anti-intellectuals, not naive, natural, nihilistic rebels without a cause, but self-consciously nihilistic pessimists capable of raising cynicism to more or less coherent philosophy and sophisticated enough to know they were doing it. And then after this, he kind of gets back into talking about Case from Neuromancer, which he describes as this new 1970s era type of punk, right? Intellectual parts of him being driven by his cybernetic trappings, pretty much. And we also get to the name Neuromancer itself, which, well, in cyberspace, Neuromancer is kind of obvious at this point. It's like kind of play on necromancer and neuro, right? And the cyberspace, he points out, is actually not really being new to Gibson. In fact, he says, I wrote something like this, and Tron had done something like this. So, he mentions also that this novel, Neuromancer, is strictly hard science fiction. But hard science fiction writers didn't like it, right? But not, well, in part because of the expert kind of like clunky science he uses. But more importantly, because the style and the character is just kind of out there. It's very different, actually, compared to what we had experienced before, because a lot of the hard science fiction writers are not what we call new wave, right? I mean, I feel like you could argue someone like Larry Niven is a hard science fiction writer and new wave, but so it's kind of, but in a sense, this is hard science fiction with new wave elements, right? And then he gets into talking about the old guard versus the new wave. And he says, and the old guard was forever accusing the new wave of being nihilistically against science and technology, while the new wave chided the old guard for its naive assumption that the upward evolution of science and technology led ipso facto to the improvement of the human condition. And he kind of, and then he gives a lot of specifics, pretty much, and basically saying there's this false dichotomy, right? That people thought you had the old guard, which had to write like this, and you had the new guard, new wave, which had to write like this, which is a little silly. I mean, like, I guess there's like generalizations there, but I mean, like, obviously not the case, because there are some new wave, I mean, there are some old guard authors that actually fit pretty well with new wave authors, right? Like Alfred Bester or Fritz Leiber, right? And someone like Vance is kind of out there doing his own thing. And I mean, Asimov tried his hand at new wave stuff and something like the gods themselves, but that's another topic. But anyways, so Gibson joins these two camps, right? He takes this dichotomy and he just throws it to the wind, right? He just does whatever he wants from taking things from both these camps, pretty much. And they thought this stuff was irreconcilable, but he does it anyways. And he kind of then talks about more how counterculture and technology then influence kind of what came after, right? And another quote says, some, like Gibson and especially John Shirley, are cyberpunks, and that much of their work is directly informed by the trappings and surface texture of contemporary rocker style. And maybe this is the reason why he doesn't prefer those certain cyberpunks, because these other authors he says are not punks, right? Others like Bruce Sterling, Louis Shiner, and Greg Bear are writing stories set in milieus from which any sort of punk aesthetic yeah, I don't know how he's writing this, anyways, is entirely absent. Gibson, and even more so, Sterling and Bear, are into scientific extrapolation quite as thoroughly as recognized hard science fiction writers like Larry Niven or Hal Clement, and then some. So he's basically saying it's all hard sci-fi, the cyberpunk stuff, but that's kind of background to the important parts, right? Which is this character, and in particular how tech has changed humanity and will change humanity, and what it means in a sense to be human with this idea, right? It's neuromantic, right? So he's really setting up a good argument for his term of neuromantics over cyberpunk. I think cyberpunk as a term is stuck, and it probably isn't going to go away, and it's a cool term. But it is true, actually, when you read a lot of cyberpunk fiction, it actually doesn't really come off as punk at all. Most of it doesn't. I mean, even someone like Ghost in the Shell, the main character is a cop. So anyways, then he goes and talks a lot about Shirley's Eclipse novel, which I haven't read. Actually, I think is the first in a trilogy. It does sound interesting. I would like to read it. And he also goes back to Greg Bear and talks about this panel, right? Again, 1985, North American Science Fiction Convention in Austin, Texas. And Greg Bear asked the question, it's like, how many of you think people will look recognizably human 50 years from now? And he said a forest of hands went up, and he says, you're all wrong. At which he was saying Greg Bear doesn't view himself as a cyberpunk or a neuromantic, I guess, in particular. because not Cyberpunk, Neuromantic, that but he says this, which was like the most Neuromantic thing anyone could say on the panel, pretty much, and did say on the panel, which is interesting because 1985, I'm terrible at math, but let's see, 95, 2005, 2015, we're only 11 years away from 50 years, and I think we're all going to look recognizably human at that point. So this is, funnily, I think, right? You read something like the Gernsback Continuum, which is taking old golden age sci-fi pulps and viewing how their future 50 years from then would feel. Like you take 1930, go 1980, it's nothing like it, right? 1980 turned out nothing like it. Well, then you have 1980s, and you have people saying, "Oh, this is what's the future going to be like. We're going to go super transhuman, right? Or post-human is the term Spinrad uses. We're not there. Okay, we're not there. I mean, like, I think one of the cooler things from recent years is Neuralink, which I know is one of Elon Musk's companies, and he's not super popular on here, but that is a really cool thing, actually. But that's like one of the biggest first inklings of like cyberpunk tech, and we're barely there. So, anyways, he also talks about Greg Bear's kind of going into like talking about the post-human thing, and in this sense, it's collective. But it's Blood Music. Blood Music, short story by Greg Bear. He turned it into a novel later. He also talks about Sterling's schismatrix. I'm not sure if that's how you say it exactly, and transhumanism from that as well, where these people, you read about them or you're hearing whatever their stuff, their thoughts when you read the story, sound very psychologically human, but they do not resemble humans really at all at this point. So, and he takes that point from talking about Blood Music and the schismatrix, and he says, "Through science and technology, we will meet the aliens, and they will be us," which I think is an interesting quote. It was just a single paragraph. That's like the one sentence in that paragraph. So, anyways, he closes with a couple few thoughts, which you can go read this if you want. So, I do think it's interesting looking at this idea of. And maybe why he, in particular, he makes a good argument for Neuromantic as a term over Cyberpunk, but he also makes a good argument for where it goes. Right, a lot of those Cyberpunk authors didn't write what most people think of as Cyberpunk for very long. I mean, stuff evolves, right? And so you're saying as a Neuromantic, that label also lasts longer. Right? It doesn't just encapsulate Neuromancer and Count Zero and maybe a couple other things. And Neuromantic also includes, stuff like Blood Music and Schismatrix, which maybe get a little out there as far as the Cyberpunk label is concerned. So anyways, I think it's interesting. I like to read actual fiction by Norman Spinrad, but I haven't, and I will probably at some point. But anyways, let me know your thoughts down below. And let me know if you want more of these. Anyways, Liam from Liam's Icy Market next time.